On American soil during World War II, a quiet paradox unfolded, one that rarely appeared in victory headlines. In small towns and along rural roads, local residents began to notice groups of unfamiliar men working from morning until evening, digging ditches, spreading gravel, and patching road surfaces with the cold discipline of a military unit. They were not American laborers, nor were they U.S. Army engineers. They spoke German. And only months earlier, these very men had been laying mines along Allied supply routes and firing on American soldiers in Europe and North Africa. Now they stood in the heart of the United States, repairing the roads that American soldiers' families used every day, working under the supervision of the U.S. military, and receiving pay from the U.S. government as part of the wartime economy. This was not done in secrecy or in the shadows, but in plain view within civilian communities, among farms, small towns, and states thousands of miles from the battlefield. What led Washington to bring hundreds of thousands of former enemies across the Atlantic and place them at the center of American society? Why would a nation fighting for survival allow its adversaries to repair its roads and build its infrastructure? To understand this, we must return to the United States in the years 1943, 1945, a time when the war still roared across Europe, yet within America itself, a very different kind of confrontation was quietly taking place. When the United States formally entered World War II in 1941, a rear area problem quickly came into focus. Across the Atlantic, Britain, after its campaigns in North Africa, had captured a number of German prisoners that exceeded the capacity of an island nation, being steadily worn down by war to house and sustain them. With few options left, London turned to Washington. In 1942, a formal request was made for the United States to accept a portion of these German prisoners. Soon afterward, Liberty ships began cutting across the Atlantic, delivering roughly 50,000 German POWs to American ports, opening a movement of people unprecedented in modern warfare. From that point on, the United States gradually became the largest holding area for Axis prisoners in the world. Not only German soldiers, but Italian and Japanese POWs were also transferred across the ocean. By the end of the war, a total of 425,871 Axis prisoners had been held on American soil. The majority of them German, alongside approximately 51,000 Italians and nearly 5,000 Japanese. To accommodate such numbers, a nationwide network of POW camps was constructed. 511 camps spread across 46 of the 48 states, from the East Coast to the West, from fertile plains to semi-arid regions. Most of the major camps were located in the southern and southwestern United States, where the milder climate reduced heating costs and made long-term administration more practical. Just as importantly, these camps were typically situated in sparsely populated rural areas, far from industrial centers and major cities, in order to minimize security risks. Even Midwestern and Great Plains, states such as Nebraska and North Dakota, hosted POW facilities. Primarily smaller satellite camps, directly tied to local agricultural operations. However, bringing hundreds of thousands of former enemy soldiers deep into the heart of the United States was far from an easy decision. From the outset, American military leaders worried about public reaction. Would civilians accept living alongside men who had only recently been firing on their sons on the battlefield? Events quickly showed that these concerns were well-founded. In many small communities, the arrival of German POWs sparked both curiosity and unease. Cautious glances and whispered suspicions spread rapidly among local residents. In response, the U.S. government moved early to control the narrative. The military dispatched officers to work directly with local authorities, meet with the press, and engage civic organizations to reassure communities about security measures, while also emphasizing a very practical consideration: economic benefit. Building POW camps meant an influx of federal funds into local areas, creating jobs for guards and logistical staff, and stimulating spending at nearby shops and services. More importantly, at a time when millions of American workers had gone to the front, prisoners could serve as a supplemental labor force for farms and factories. For many towns, this prospect was enough to shift public attitudes. In places like Hearne, Texas, local leaders even actively lobbied to have POW camps located nearby, viewing them as a wartime economic opportunity. Alongside these economic calculations, Washington also recognized a deeper strategic advantage. Humane treatment of prisoners was not only an obligation under international law, but a long-term psychological weapon. U.S. Army Command insisted on strict adherence to the 1929 Geneva Convention. Living conditions in POW camps were to be comparable to those in American military barracks. Each German enlisted prisoner was allocated roughly 40 square feet of living space, equivalent to that of U.S. soldiers, while German officers received 3 times that amount. In camps that were still under construction, American guards were even required to live in tents under the same conditions as the prisoners, rather than occupy permanent barracks. Food rations were likewise standardized, ensuring nutrition equivalent to that provided to U.S. troops stationed at home. That apparent generosity did not stem from pure humanitarianism. It was a cold calculation. Washington understood that how it treated German prisoners would echo back to the battlefields of Europe. And it did. As news of the relatively tolerable conditions in American POW camps spread to the front, many German soldiers chose to raise their hands in surrender to the Allies rather than fight to the bitter end. Quietly, the United States turned its own rear areas into a psychological front, one where war was no longer decided by gunfire, but by how defeated soldiers were treated after the fighting stopped. When German POWs set foot on American soil, the first thing they encountered was a very concrete difference in how war was organized. The Atlantic crossing was orderly, with food rations far more adequate than what many had known for years at the front. For men coming straight from North Africa or the Italian campaigns, being properly fed did not feel like a luxury. It was simply a sign that the United States still possessed a stable logistical system. Even as the war continued to expand, after reaching port, the prisoners were transported by rail to inland camps. Many realized that this journey was more comfortable than previous troop movements they had experienced in the German army. Upon entering the camps, they saw rows of neatly arranged barracks, bunk beds equipped with mattresses, blankets, and pillows, and daily life governed by a fixed schedule. The camps were organized more like military installations than prisons in the traditional sense. Everything was clearly defined rules, boundaries, routines, with little room for arbitrariness. Fritz Enslin, a tank gunner who had endured months of harsh conditions, quickly grasped the significance of this difference. He was not confronted with retaliation, but with a life tightly regulated by rules. The first meal in the camp surprised many prisoners, not because it was exceptional, but because it demonstrated that the United States was capable of maintaining a consistent standard of living for both its own soldiers and its prisoners. By the final stages of the war, this was something the German system itself could no longer sustain. From that point on, comparative remarks began to circulate within the camps, not to praise the enemy, but as a way to make sense of why the balance of the war was steadily shifting. Many prisoners came to realize that they had been fighting for a system increasingly short of resources, while their opponent was still able to keep its rear areas functioning at a steady pace. This awareness did not arrive in a single moment. It accumulated gradually through the routines of daily life. For a segment of the American public, however, the POW camps provoked discomfort. The nickname Fritz Ritz emerged as a sarcastic label, reflecting the resentment of families who had loved ones serving at the front. From the U.S. military's perspective, though, these camps were never intended to win public sympathy. Their purpose was to maintain order limit friction, and make use of available manpower at a time of severe wartime labor shortages. Outside working hours, prisoners were permitted to take part in organized communal activities. Camp canteens sold basic necessities. Some camps arranged film screenings, sports, and musical events to preserve a stable daily rhythm. At Crossville, Tennessee, a number of German officers played tennis within the campgrounds, not as a privilege, but as part of a regulated routine meant to maintain discipline and morale. Books and newspapers were brought into the camps, libraries were established, and through the Red Cross, some prisoners enrolled in correspondence courses. For many, this period offered a rare chance to read and reflect while waiting for the war to end. Letters sent home often described this time as a phase of temporary stability after years of constant movement and combat. Escape attempts were relatively rare. The vastness of the country, the geographic distance, and the condition of Germany at the time meant that breaking out offered little realistic hope. One prisoner in Mississippi wrote that remaining in the camp meant survival, whereas returning to Europe then meant facing an extremely uncertain future. The U.S. military limited the release of detailed information about POW camps to the public. The goal was to prevent the issue of prisoners from becoming a focal point of controversy in a society already under immense wartime strain. Even so, rumors spread. Many American families reacted with anger when they heard about the living conditions of German POWs. The press raised questions, Congress demanded explanations, and the War Department was forced to repeatedly clarify that these policies were intended to protect American prisoners held on the other side of the front lines. One American officer later recalled stopping a convoy in a town and buying soft drinks for both guards and prisoners, only to be shouted down by local residents who accused him of betrayal. That moment revealed how war existed not only on distant battlefields, but also deep within the emotions of the home front, where any decision involving the enemy could quickly become a moral flashpoint. From this point on, the story of German POWs on American soil was no longer purely a military matter. It reflected how a wartime society sought to manage conflict, public emotion, and scarce resources, while still maintaining order until the war's end. Despite these conflicting reactions, the reality was that wartime America badly needed healthy prisoners. More than 16 million American men served in the armed forces, leaving a vast labor shortage at home. Factories and farms were critically understaffed, especially from 1943 onward. Circumstances forced the U.S. government to draw upon the available POW labor pool. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners excluding officers could be required to work, provided the tasks were safe, not directly tied to military objectives, and compensated appropriately. The U.S. Army adhered to these rules. Each working prisoner received a minimum wage of 80 cents per day, equivalent to the pay of an American private, about $15 in 2024 terms. In practice, wages were issued in the form of camp scrip rather than cash, to prevent prisoners from using real money to plan escapes. The pay was modest compared to free civilian labor, but for prisoners it was preferable to idleness and allowed them to purchase small comforts such as candy or cigarettes at the camp canteen. From 1943 to 1944, German POWs were mobilized across a wide range of economic sectors throughout the United States. They picked oranges in California, worked in food canning plants, cut timber in forests, harvested cotton and peanuts in Texas, dug potatoes in Maine, and reaped corn in Illinois. Virtually any form of manual labor facing shortages could draw on prisoner labor. Tasks considered dangerous or sensitive, such as work in armaments, factories, or military ports, were strictly off-limits. The focus remained on agriculture and civilian construction. In 1943, an agricultural official in Texas acknowledged that the entire cotton harvest in southern Texas that year would have been lost without the assistance of German POWs. Many American farmers were initially wary, but soon became satisfied with employing prisoners. They paid the government 25 to 50% less than the cost of regular workers and could rely on a steady supply of labor whenever needed. Language barriers and the risk of escape were concerns, but with military discipline already ingrained, most prisoners proved diligent and dependable, with the quality of their work often rated higher than average. Notably, many transportation and infrastructure projects across the United States were built or repaired with direct contributions from German POWs. Within military installations, prisoners worked as masons and carpenters, expanding barracks and facilities for their own camps. They were also dispatched to local construction sites as needed. At Fort Benning, Georgia, German POWs were assigned to dig drainage ditches and repair internal routes used daily by American soldiers and their families. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, prisoners built a spillway in what is now Johnson State Park, near the city of Hattiesburg, helping to establish the area's water management infrastructure. Other groups participated in repairing federal highways, including roadwork in Pennsylvania, and the maintenance of roads around factories and industrial sites in the Midwest, as recorded in local recollections. From the cotton fields of Texas to rural American roads, the footprints of German POWs were everywhere. They wielded shovels and tools instead of rifles, their sweat falling onto the very land of the former enemy they had once fought. To manage POW labor, the U.S. military established numerous small satellite camps near production sites. These camps were temporary compounds, subordinate to larger main POW camps, designed to place prisoners close to their daily work sites and return them to the main camp each evening. In Nebraska alone, for example, there were as many as 23 satellite camps scattered around farms and small towns, linked to major camps such as Scottsbluff and Fort Robinson. Prisoners typically set out at dawn by truck or train to the fields, worked throughout the day, and were transported back to camp in the late afternoon. A daily schedule recorded at a camp in Orange County, California, illustrates the routine. Wake up at 5:30 a.m. Work in the orchards, beginning at 7:30 a.m., picking oranges, with a quota of 36 crates per prisoner per day. Lunch at noon, with those who met their quota early, allowed to rest sooner. The workday, ending at 4:30 p.m. Dinner at 5:30 p.m. Evenings spent in educational classes, film screenings, or organized cultural activities. And lights out at 10 p.m. Prisoners who failed to meet quotas or violated discipline were placed in disciplinary confinement and restricted to bread and water as a deterrent. Overall, the U.S. Army sought to maintain strict labor discipline while applying clear systems of reward and punishment to encourage productivity. During this period, many German POWs demonstrated notable skill and dedication. One report indicated that their productivity was often slightly lower than that of free civilian labor, but more consistent, with output quality frequently rated above average. This was not surprising. German military discipline was already ingrained, and many prisoners had been skilled tradesmen before conscription, now returning to familiar work. Instances of covert resistance or sabotage did occur, but they were rare and caused no significant damage. In fact, there were no major acts of sabotage by German POWs throughout their time working in the United States. Their overriding objective was simply to survive the war, not to provoke further hostility. The presence of hundreds of thousands of German POWs on American soil created striking social interactions between the enemy and ordinary civilians. At first, many local communities reacted with fear or caution. Gradually, however, the openness of Americans and the discipline and politeness of the Germans began to draw the two sides closer together in everyday life. In rural areas, the atmosphere at times felt like a strange documentary scene. American farmers working side by side in the fields with German soldiers. American housewives curiously trying to communicate in halting English to give instructions to POW laborers, and children eagerly watching the unintentional foreign guests in their villages. In a small town in Nebraska, 10-year-old Kelly Holthus recalled how intensely curious the children were. They gathered at the main street corner to watch columns of prisoners as they walked through town, treating it as a sight unlike anything they had ever seen. We'd just sit there, eyes wide open. When the prisoners passed by, it felt like the war had suddenly come close to us. Holthus remembered. In reality, the arrival of the POWs allowed many Americans to see the enemy in flesh and blood for the first time. They realized that these young soldiers were ordinary, often gentle, and even shy, far removed from the image of the brutal German portrayed in wartime propaganda. As contact continued, prejudice slowly faded. Many German POWs used their work assignments as opportunities to practice English, chatting with farmers and American guards. They spoke about families back home, about farms in Bavaria, or factories in the Ruhr, where they had once worked. In return, they asked about America, about its vast fields, or the towering buildings they passed along the way. Quiet friendships began to form across the camp fences. At Fort Benning, Georgia, the children of stationed soldiers would slip behind the camp after school to talk with the German uncles working nearby. They secretly brought candy or cigarettes to the prisoners and spent hours exchanging stories. Many POWs surprised Americans with their education and cultural knowledge. Quite a few had been university students, engineers, or master craftsmen, and were courteous, well-spoken, and capable of conversing fluently in English. Human compassion flickered even within these ironic circumstances. A. U. S. veteran who worked at Camp McCain in Mississippi, recalled that his family once helped a German POW suffering from severe nearsightedness. In gratitude, the prisoner painted a portrait of the family's mother and carefully carved a pair of wooden bookends from scrap wood as keepsakes. The American family treasured these gifts and preserved them for many years after the war as symbols of reconciliation. At Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri, another POW who was an artist painted landscapes for the father of an American officer in exchange for paints and canvases. The father believed the man was probably happier painting in Missouri than carrying a rifle on the battlefield. At the Crossville camp in Tennessee, Italian POWs even decorated an entire hall wall with murals. Years after the war, the hall was repurposed as a recreation space for a youth summer camp, and the artwork was preserved as a distinctive legacy left by those once unwelcome guests. Even so, American civilians were not always friendly toward prisoners. The pain of wartime loss made forgiveness difficult for some. As a result, there were shopkeepers who refused service and hurled insults at both POWs and their guards out of bitterness. Racial discrimination in the United States at the time also produced stark and troubling contradictions. At Walterboro Army Airfield in South Carolina, where African-American Tuskegee Airmen were trained, Black American pilots were barred from the base canteen designated for whites, while white German POWs were free to use it and spend the wages they had earned. This injustice, one of many such examples, was later recalled by the son of a U.S. officer as a painful stain on history, when the enemy was treated better than citizens solely because of skin color. Such deep social fractures in American society, particularly racial segregation, were sometimes laid bare in the very way foreign prisoners were treated. All the same, most encounters between American civilians and German POWs unfolded in a peaceful and humane manner. Many prisoners genuinely grew fond of the United States through these interactions. They found ordinary Americans friendly, generous, and not inclined to hold grudges. The son of a former German POW later recalled that his family was deeply grateful that his father had been captured by American forces rather than falling into Soviet hands, an outcome that gave him a chance to survive the war. That former prisoner once told his son that being captured by the Americans was the greatest stroke of luck of my life, because he was treated decently and even had moments of leisure, such as playing tennis and spending time outdoors, while many of his comrades either perished or endured brutal imprisonment on the Eastern Front. Stories like these circulated after the war and helped mend perceptions between Germans and Americans. A number of romantic relationships also emerged between prisoners and local civilians, particularly once the fighting had ended. There were cases in which German POWs married American women after the war. Although such relationships were not widespread since most prisoners were eventually repatriated, they demonstrated how lines of hostility could fade when people lived alongside one another and came to understand each other. In May 1945, the war in Europe ended with the total defeat of Nazi Germany. For German POWs in the United States, the news brought mixed emotions. They were relieved that the war was over, meaning their lives had been spared. Yet they were also anxious about what lay ahead. What would a devastated Germany be like upon their return? Would their families, wives, children, parents still be alive after the bombing? Many feared reprisals or prosecution by the Allies for war crimes they might be associated with. Even indirectly, the United States quickly began planning the repatriation of prisoners. From late 1945 through mid-1946, most German POWs were gradually returned to Europe. However, the complexities of the post-war situation meant that not everyone went home immediately. Britain and France, both heavily damaged by the war, retained large numbers of German prisoners to help with reconstruction. Many POWs transferred from American camps to Britain and France were required to continue working until 1947, 1948, before being released and allowed to return home. This practice technically violated the Geneva Convention, which called for the prompt repatriation of prisoners after the end of hostilities, but at the time, there was little public objection given the immense devastation caused by the Nazi regime. In the United States, POW camps gradually began to close. Before the prisoners were put aboard ships, U.S. authorities screened documentary footage for them showing newly liberated Nazi concentration camps. The images, piles of corpses, and the horrific machinery of extermination left many prisoners shocked and ashamed. Most German POWs had previously encountered only fragments of propaganda or vague rumors about the crimes of Hitler's regime. Only then did they fully grasp the scale of the atrocities. Many sat in silence, some quietly in tears, carrying that heavy realization with them on the voyage home. Even so, the experience of life in the United States left a profound mark on hundreds of thousands of these men. The historian Arnold Kramer, after years of interviewing former prisoners, observed, "I have never met a German POW who did not tell me that the time he spent imprisoned in the United States was the best period of his life." It may sound paradoxical, but for soldiers who had passed through the hell of war, months of safety, adequate food, and stability in American camps truly felt like a gift. Most German POWs left the United States with a very favorable impression of the country and its people. They had not been subjected to abuse or starvation. Instead, they learned English and were exposed to American culture and democratic values. Many returned to Germany with several $100s in accumulated wages, a significant sum that helped their families survive the difficult early post-war years. For some, living in the United States brought about a deeper transformation. They became supporters of democracy and opponents of dictatorship. Regarding this shift as the most important lesson of their lives, after returning home, a number of former prisoners could not forget the American dream. Around 5,000 Germans later came back to the United States to settle permanently, applying for immigration, becoming U.S. citizens, and contributing to the development of the very country they had once fought against. Thousands of others returned repeatedly as visitors. Some became merchants who traveled back and forth across the Atlantic. One notable example is William Oberdiek. He had been a POW at the Atlanta camp in Nebraska and worked at the nearby Kimmel orchard. After returning to Germany, Oberdiek made the decision to go back to Nebraska in 1947, becoming a regular employee at the very orchard where he had once labored as a prisoner. He mastered English, became a naturalized American citizen, and eventually purchased the entire Kimmel orchard, building a new life on the land that had once confined him. Stories as improbable as this did in fact occur, offering powerful evidence of the possibilities for reconciliation and connection after war. Of course, not all German POWs came to admire the United States. Yet the vast majority acknowledged upon returning home that Americans had treated them humanely. This experience likely helped lay the groundwork for West Germany's rapid alignment with the United States during the Cold War. Former enemies set aside hostility and moved forward together. A wartime survey conducted in November 1943 found that 74% of Americans criticized the Nazi regime but did not harbor hatred toward the German people, an attitude of restraint that helped millions of Germans avoid collective ostracism after the war and enabled German-American relations to improve quickly. Today, when driving along rural roads in the United States, few people realize that some of those roads were built or repaired by the hands of former German soldiers. Bridges, parks, and farms to which they contributed still remain, quietly marking a chapter of history that is rarely mentioned. Indeed, the German POW camps that once dotted the American landscape have largely faded into obscurity. In many communities that once hosted POW camps, younger generations today are often unaware that their towns had housed thousands of enemy soldiers during the war. From time to time, however, deeply moving reunions are held. Former German POWs return to visit the places where they were once confined, reconnecting with American veterans and local residents who had guarded them or worked alongside them decades earlier. In states such as Louisiana, Maine, and Georgia, such gatherings between former prisoners, former guards, and civilians have taken place after many years, drawing curious media attention to a rarely told aspect of the war. Handshakes and tears at these reunions show that the curtain of the past can indeed fall, and that people are capable of forgiveness and empathy, even after having once been enemies. Roads in America repaired by those who once fought America, a phrase that sounds almost like a joke. Yet it encapsulates a striking historical paradox. Amid the most brutal conflict of the 20th century, small but genuine stories of humanity still flickered into existence. Yesterday's enemies could become tomorrow's friends or partners, given the chance to understand one another under the right circumstances. The roads paved by German POWs decades ago did more than connect places. They became quiet symbols of reconciliation. In this way, even amid the smoke and fire of war, compassion and respect for human dignity can take root in the most unexpected places. And over time, these small seeds of goodwill helped heal the wounds between nations, just as the United States and Germany moved beyond a painful past to build a strong alliance after World War II. It is, in the end, a hopeful conclusion to a strange yet deeply memorable chapter of history.